Star Trek Academy Collision Course, Chapter 33. His first day as a member of Starfleet wasn't as bad as Kirk had feared. It was worse. He and Spock were roused from their cells at Starfleet headquarters at 0400 hours, given 30 minutes to shower, eat, and get into their civilian clothes. By 0440, they'd been discharged from Starfleet custody, signed over to 2 Starfleet Masters-at-Arms, and marched onto a Starfleet air shuttle. The flight from HQ to the Starfleet Training Center took all of 7 minutes. Kirk had watched the Academy pass by below, the lights lining the paths and roadways, sparkling through the black silhouettes of the trees. Most of the room lights in Archer Hall were out, and anyway, the angle was wrong to see Alyssa's room. Spock said nothing on the short trip. Kirk knew there was a lot they both had to say to each other, but they hadn't had a moment together without a guard or escort since they'd been taken from the courtroom. At least Spock had demonstrated he wasn't a complete, uncaring alien lump. Kirk had caught him looking down at the Vulcan diplomatic compound as they had sailed over it. The assemblage of alien architecture was difficult to miss, especially at night, when its flood-lit buildings glowed like rubies in a field of glittering blue-white diamonds. The air shuttle touched down on a well-worn pad about 100 meters from STC's main gates. 2 white and blue Starfleet buses hovered by those gates. As he and Spock were escorted from the shuttle to a pedestrian walkway, Kirk could see that each bus was filled with eager young faces. "Looks like you two will have a lot of company," one of the escorts said. Kirk didn't think of the kids in the buses as company. As far as he was concerned, they were the competition. Spock, not surprisingly, said, "Indeed." Kirk was beginning to suspect the Vulcan was nervous. Their paperwork, all on large, clunky pads that seemed to be 50 years old at least, was waiting in the guard shack. They were given 5 minutes to complete it, all 47 pages and 15 signature windows. Given the time limit, Kirk signed without reading. Enlistment document, dependency application, record of emergency data, medical waivers describing risk of accident, death, dismemberment. He had to stop to read the definition of what? Anyway, he kept paging through. He rolled his eyes when he signed the final window that affirmed he was voluntarily enlisting, then slid the pad back over the counter to the intake officer. 47 pages in 5 minutes, Kirk said to Spock. Starfleet planning at its best. Spock put on his most bland expression. "I read them all." Kirk frowned, and they were marched out of the office and onto the grounds of the STC. At 0600 hours, with the sky brightening in the dawn, Kirk, Spock, and 70 other recruits were encouraged by uniformed personnel to stand at attention in a formation of 4 lines of 18. A tall petty officer with a deeply lined face and a booming voice welcomed the recruits with a 5-minute recitation of the history of the STC, with all the enthusiasm of someone who had given the same speech 1,000 times. As an institution, the training center had been operating for well more than a century. The first crews to serve in the old United Earth Starfleet trained here, as did the scientific teams of the United Earth Space Probe Agency. Mako pilots, merchant marines, the first diplomatic exchange groups headed for Andoria, Teller, and Denobula, all passed through these gates, enlisted personnel and officers alike. Kirk guessed that's why the low buildings looked so old and so behind the times. He was not impressed. The moment the history lesson was over, the recruits were marched again toward the quartermaster building. Inside, in controlled chaos, Tables were laid out with standard Starfleet kit, clothes, boots, underwear, hygiene kits, and a large duffel in which to stuff everything. The recruits had 5 minutes to find everything they needed. Kirk was beginning to see the pattern. Then more marching into another building where the males went through a door on one side and the females through the other to shed their civilian clothes and give up their personal belongings. Kirk watched as Spock ingeniously argued his way into keeping some kind of Vulcan medallion that he wore around his neck. The Vulcan achieved this by calmly explaining to an exasperated clerk that it had deep cultural significance and that any attempt to force him to remove it would be a violation of his cultural rights as specified on page 27 of the intake documents he had signed less than an hour ago. Seems Spock had read all the paperwork after all. Dressed in ill-fitting recruit whites, including stiff-billed ball caps with a red Starfleet chevron, their next stop was a barber shop. Kirk looked in the mirror after his 60-second makeover, and all he saw was his crew-cut father staring back at him. The difference was that Kirk didn't yet have sideburns that could be cut to a point. Spock ended up looking like a mythical elf. The long hair that had covered his ears was now nothing more than dark stubble from which his ears stood out like dangerous weapons. Kirk had to give the Vulcan high marks for apparently not noticing how all the other recruits kept staring at him. Less than 90 minutes after stepping through the center's gates, the transformation of the recruits was startling. 72 civilians, male and female, in multicolored clothes, all shapes and sizes, had been roughly molded into a squad of identically dressed, flush-faced clones. Other than height, about the only difference among them that Kirk could make out was that the females had been allowed to keep more of their hair. Spock, of course, was the exception. He was noticeably different, and not just because he was one of the tallest recruits in the formation. Then the gauntlet began. Suddenly, 8 petty officers appeared out of nowhere and started berating the recruits. This one's hat was at the wrong angle. That one's shirt wasn't aligned properly. What's that smudge doing on that boot, mister? Don't call me sir, I work for a living. If recruits try to apologize, they're shouted at even more. Did I ask for an apology? Are you giving me an excuse, mister? Get those shoulders back, eyes forward, chin in. Not that far. Kirk couldn't believe how transparent this show of domination was. 2 petty officers decided to take on Spock, whose posture, attitude, and uniform were perfect. They couldn't even make him blink. Then one of the 2, haranguing Spock, noticed Kirk watching, and like predators sensing a weak member of the herd, they abandoned their uncooperative prey and swooped in on easier pickings with a barely concealed smirk. "What are you looking at, recruit?" one shouted. Kirk had heard what the others had answered, correctly and incorrectly. It wasn't difficult to answer correctly. "Nothing, Chief." "I saw you looking, recruit. Are you calling me a liar?" "No, Chief. It won't happen again, Chief." "So you were looking, if you say so, Chief." By now Kirk had both chief petty officers a few centimeters from his face, screaming at ear-splitting volumes, spraying spittle on him as they spoke in rapid-fire cadence. "Are you mouthing off, recruit?" "No, Chief." "Do you think you're a smart guy, recruit?" Kirk knew it was wrong. But he couldn't stop himself. "No, Chief. I am a Starfleet recruit." But for about half a second, Kirk had a taste of victory. The 2 petty officers actually paused in their assault as they processed his insult. Then they redoubled their efforts to get Kirk flustered. "Do you think this is funny, recruit?" Kirk thought, this is too easy. "Yes, Chief." Both petty officers sputtered. "What did you say?" "As a Starfleet recruit, I am on my honor to tell the truth and ensure the full truth is known, Chief." 4 petty officers swarmed around Kirk now, and he was ordered to the ground to do push-ups. Kirk dropped as ordered and did as he was told. 1 petty officer squatted beside him, while 2 others harangued the other recruits for watching. The 4th petty officer got on his hands and knees so he could shout into Kirk's ear with each push-up. Everything blurred together, not because any of it overwhelmed Kirk, but because none of it meant anything to someone who had gazed down the barrel of a laser rifle and realized he was going to die. There was nothing even Starfleet petty officers could do that could come close to what he'd already survived. Tarsus 4. By the time 14-year-old Jimmy returned to his cabin with Matthew and the other boys, he was feeling warmer. The concentrate bars had settled his stomach too, eased the hunger pangs, though now he felt guilty for not having saved any for the others. "Go get him out," Matthew told him. "It's so cold," Jimmy said. "Maybe we should wait till the morning?" "It won't be cold for long. Get him out." Jimmy walked up the 3 wooden steps to the cabin door, knocked on it. "Hey guys, it's me." The door creaked open. Aki Kimura was there, very scared, very small. He was only 8 years old, visiting his great-grandparents for the summer. Jimmy had liked meeting his great-grandmother. She'd been in Starfleet, fought the Xindi, had great stories to tell, and she made wonderful soba noodles. "Hey, Aki, how are you?" Jimmy asked. Aki bit his lip, looked past Jimmy, and gave a small whimper. Jimmy turned to see Matthew and the others all aiming their rifles at the open door. "Come on, Jimmy," Matthew urged. "We got to get back." Jimmy felt as if he was watching himself on a view screen. The words wouldn't form in his mind, but he could see what was going to happen. The pressure to keep going without thinking, to do what he was told, was too much for him. It would be so easy just to open the door all the way, step back, call out the rest of the kids, and let Matthew and the boys in the red bandanas do what Jimmy feared they would do. So easy. Especially since Jimmy knew that if he didn't do that, if he resisted, if he argued, he'd be the first to be shot. He wondered if they could run. Maybe that was the way. If he could get all the kids to suddenly run out in a stampede, like the trans cattle, maybe Matthew would hesitate just a bit. Just enough for the kids to race it off across the field of withered grain and into the blighted forest, and then they'd be okay. They could make it to another valley in the daytime. It'd be warm enough. Maybe they could find a cave. And Jimmy even knew how to catch small animals and birds because his father had taught him official Starfleet survival training when they went camping. If there were some birds left in the next valley, or the valley after that, then Kirk could catch them all, and the kids would be okay until someone came to rescue them. The plan flashed through Jimmy's mind in a second. He didn't know if it could work, but he did know that it had to. "What's the holdup?" Matthew complained. "Tell everyone to put on their shoes and slippers," Jimmy said quickly to Aki, "and wrap up in all the blankets, okay?" But Aki shook his head, and Jimmy saw tears in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Jimmy asked. "They're not here," Aki said. "They went after you." Jimmy gently pushed the young boy aside, stepped into the cabin. The bunks were stripped of blankets, even sheets. He called the names of the kids he knew. No answer. He stepped back into the doorway. "Matthew, they're not here." Matthew and the red bandana boys pushed Jimmy back as they stormed into the cabin, using their rifles to pry up the mattresses, kicking open the bathroom door. They swore like the older kids, language Jimmy would never use. His father was very strict about that. "We're in so much trouble," Matthew said. Then he pushed Jimmy against the cabin wall. "Nah, you're the one in trouble. When Griffin finds out everyone escaped because of you, you're off the list, Jimmy." Jimmy saw his way out. "I'll find him, okay? They must have gone off the road, tried a shortcut. I bet they're in the glade by the Leighton farm. That's a fast way back." Matthew nodded. "Okay, you go through the glade. We'll circle around on the road and be there when they come out. But if they make it back to the storehouses and Griffin sees them, we're all off the list, get it? You ruined everything, so all of us have to pay for it." The other boys glared at Jimmy. He had to get away. "I'll go now. I'll run." He held out his hand to Aki. "Come on." But Matthew grabbed Aki's shoulder, pulled him close. We'll take care of the brat. You go and you run, and I'll see you on the other side of the glade. Jimmy couldn't argue, not with 4 laser rifles pointed at him. Sure, Matthew, he said. I'll run. He looked at Aki, knew he wouldn't see the child again. I'll see you, Aki. We'll catch up with your Bon and Oji-san, okay? Aki attempted a brave smile at the mention of his great-grandparents. And then, hating himself, knowing that his father would never run from someone needing help, that's what Jimmy Kirk did. And when he heard the laser rifles fire behind him, he ran faster, knowing what a failure he was, knowing how much he had let poor Aki down. He didn't think it would ever be possible to feel worse. He was wrong. Kirk came out of his haze when he realized his face had just slammed into the paved parade ground. Give me more, recruit! The order, loud as it was, came from a great distance, almost drowned out by the buzzing in Kirk's ears and the pounding of his heartbeat. I said, give me more! Kirk realized his arms wouldn't move. He knew they were there because he could feel them burning along with his chest, but they just lay beside him, useless. Even in his haze, though, he knew he shouldn't offer an apology or an excuse, nothing to set the Harriers after him again. Do you hear me? Kirk lay immobile on the ground. If he didn't play, they couldn't win. Finally, he was aware of the petty officer getting up beside him. The next order was shouted at someone else. You two! Get this shirker on his feet! Kirk felt 2 pairs of hands grab him under the arms and lift. He swayed unsteady, arms on fire, dimly aware of the petty officers gathering around him again for more. They wouldn't get the better of him, he vowed. The first day went downhill from there. Chapter 34. At the end of that first day, Kirk and Spock had been assigned to the 18-member Gold Team under the direct command of Master Chief Petty Officer Mary Elizabeth Gianni. Their leader was a formidable woman who claimed to hold the center's record for largest number of recruits to wash out before completing basic training. She also claimed she had never seen a group of recruits so ill-suited to the service. Spock did not believe her. While marching past the blue team barracks, he had heard distinctly another petty officer make the same claim to his charges. In any event, there seemed to be no logic in an all-volunteer service that first strove to attract the best candidates possible, then tried to dissuade those candidates from completing their training. In fact, he had observed a great deal of posturing and dramatics in just his first few hours here. Spock was not impressed. Misleading training techniques aside, though, this first day had been an interesting experience. The other recruits had gawked at him, especially after his long hair was shorn to half-centimeter stubble, but he was used to that level of attention from aliens. Something he was not used to was that no one had shown him any special treatment. The training staff had been as loud and disruptive toward him as they had been to the other recruits. Spock found that refreshingly satisfactory. Not that they had been able to disrupt his concentration, of course. He recognized that was the purpose of the exercise, to desensitize recruits to noise, disorder, and confusion, so they could think clearly and act decisively in emergency situations on board a vessel in deep space, or when surrounded by hostile aliens on a distant world, or during any one of the hundreds of other unexpected disasters that could befall explorers. Vulcan children, however, learned to ignore noise, disorder, and confusion as toddlers. If a yowling zealot demanding dinner were able to divert a Vulcan child from preparing that dinner, Spock doubted that any household would allow the pets. The consumption rate would be unacceptable. Spock had had a zealot and survived. Given just that one facet of Vulcan upbringing, he knew there was nothing that the Starfleet trainers today could have done or said at any volume to affect his concentration. Interestingly enough, he had seen a similar unshakable mental focus in Jim Kirk. True, the trainers had been able to exhaust the human teenager physically after his 112 push-ups, but there was no real trick to that, Spock knew. Each species had its own physiological limits which no force of will could overcome. That was elementary biology. Even Vulcan muscles could be starved of energy after 1,000 push-ups or so in Earth normal gravity. But despite forcing Jim Kirk into physical exhaustion, the Starfleet trainers had not been able to throw him off balance mentally. Spock had been fascinated to watch that particular contest. It was almost as if, at some time in his past, the young human had faced a situation or situations exceeding any pressure the trainers could subject him to. The other recruits, all human, most from Earth, had behaved as expected, reflecting their inexperience with the harsh realities of life away from their paradisiacal planet and colony worlds. As the trainers hoped, the young novices were flustered by the onslaught of shouted, overlapping commands, and they lost the ability to concentrate effectively. Spock had no difficulty reading, in their untutored conduct, an explosion of emotional states, from anger to embarrassment to frustration. Admirably, though, no one had spoken back to the trainers or run off. Instead, it accepted the confusion and fought to rise above it. If their responses were common to all humans, and not just those predisposed to a Starfleet career, Spock could see how the human species, at some time in the future, might rise above its tendencies for erratic behavior. Everything considered, he was looking forward to the days ahead. He anticipated that they were going to be even more interesting, and he hoped that soon they might also prove challenging. But for now, as far as he was concerned, Starfleet training was something to observe, not to take part in. Spock's musing came to an end when Master Chief Gianni completed her barracks inspection, the last activity of the scheduled night routine. Spock, like the other 18 recruits, stood at parade rest by his bunk in the common sleeping area. His footlocker was open with all items on display, arranged as indicated in the Starfleet Recruits Manual, which was the one book the new recruits were currently allowed to have in their personal reading pads. He wore his recruit whites, boots gleaming, hat stowed in the locker, his bunk taut with precision as demanded. Gianni found fault with several other recruits, scolded them loudly, and stood over them as they realigned the items in their lockers or remade their bunks. When she came to Kirk, whose bunk was 2 down from Spock's, she found no fault with his preparations, but made cutting remarks about the dirt on the front of his uniform. He had not been allowed to change since the incident on the parade ground. When Gianni came to Spock, she eyed all his preparations with deep suspicion, but in the end could find nothing to find fault with. Though it seemed to cause her some distress, she said, "Good work, recruit." Spock remained at parade rest, hands behind his back, eyes forward. Gianni didn't walk on. "You're allowed to say thank you when complimented, recruit." Spock immediately said, "Thank you," and Gianni launched her attack. "Thank you what?" Spock considered her attempt to find at least one thing to correct about him a reach, but he gave her her due. "Thank you, Master Chief." Gianni walked on, completed her inspection, then stood at the front of the barracks precisely as a time alert chimed. 2200 hours is lights out. Feel free to cry yourself to sleep because you miss your mommies and daddies, and I will see you at 0500. Good night, Gold Team. Almost in unison, the 18 recruits shouted, "Good night, Master Chief!" And then the barracks plunged into darkness, the void penetrated only by a pale green light strip that ran along the center of the common area, apparently to guide new recruits to the latrine in the middle of the night. Spock quickly undressed and got into his bunk in his underwear. Sleepwear was not part of their Starfleet kit at this time. To relax before his evening's meditation, he resumed his ongoing calculations to prove the Riemann hypothesis for prime numbers. He perceived he was getting close, and with a few more years of calculations, he felt confident of achieving success. It was soothing work. Within 20 minutes, even as he pictured the equations setting the pattern of trivial zeros established by the Riemann zeta function, Spock could hear and identify 16 different breathing patterns in the barracks, all indicative of exhausted sleep. For a few moments, he wondered about the identity of the one recruit, other than himself, who was not yet asleep, and then he heard surreptitious movement. With his dark adapted vision, Spock had no trouble seeing Jim Kirk rise from his bunk, already dressed. Silently, the human moved toward the barracks exit door and slipped out. No one else was disturbed. Their sleeping patterns hadn't changed. Spock weighed the pros and cons of going after him. They still needed to talk about Kirk's brother's involvement with a criminal organization that included a woman named Dala. Spock was unwilling to accept that the unwelcome name was a coincidence. Real crime was too rare on this planet. But there was also the possibility that Kirk was planning on escaping from Starfleet, as his brother had suggested. If that was the case, then the only logical course was to avoid further entanglements with Kirk. That conclusion reached, Spock set aside his calculations and brought his hands together, fingertips joined, to begin his meditation. An hour of that, followed by a few minutes of sleep, and he would be ready to face a new day in Starfleet, with or without Jim Kirk. He had little doubt it would be much easier without. Whether it was because of the growing ache in his arms and chest, or his worry for Sam, or just that he was constitutionally unable to do what he was told by people he did not respect, Kirk left the barracks because he had to walk. The damp night air off the bay was bracing, and the light fog swirled in misty streamers as it flowed past the floodlights and footpath markers that traced the low buildings and the many ways through the STC. Kirk saw a few other pedestrians around. As he crossed a path between two large buildings, he glimpsed a large group of enlisted members jogging in the athletic field. They had backpacks, and two runners up front carried unit flags. Night maneuvers, he guessed. That'll be something to look forward to, he thought with a sigh. Another building held the officers' club, and the windows flared with light. As personnel entered and exited the building, Kirk could hear raised voices, an excited conversation, the clink of flatware and glasses. Since all Starfleet officers were trained at the academy, he guessed everyone inside that particular club worked at STC. Looking from across a garden walkway, he could see into the building through its bright windows. He saw teams of white-jacketed servers bearing heaping plates to the officers at the tables. Kirk thought back to the extruded food chunks he and the other recruits had been served 6 hours ago in what was mockingly called the evening meal. It looked like the officers were eating steaks in there. The hypocrisy of the place astounded and annoyed him. He walked on, grateful at least for the fact that he wasn't hungry. He rounded one building, and there before him were 3 shuttle landing pads well within the center's grounds. He decided they were probably for official Starfleet traffic, and not air shuttles bringing in new recruits. Beyond them, he saw the elevated monorail station. The trains there departed either for the Sloan Complex Island or the Academy. He tried not to dwell on the thought that Alyssa was only 20 minutes away. There was no use in torturing himself. Kirk chose to skirt the well-lit pads and see if a train schedule was posted at the station. It was. Generally, it appeared he could count on a train leaving for the Academy every 25 minutes during the operational hours of 0500 to midnight. The headlight of an arriving monorail train stabbed the darkness as it silently approached the station, and Kirk ducked back into the shadows. By the time any passengers reached the ground, he was long gone. Already feeling more settled by his unauthorized outing, Kirk circled back toward the Gold Team barracks and encountered a small observation tower no doubt intended for some obscure and probably unnecessary training activity. It was only about 15 meters tall, with a ladder running up the center support pylon. There were no lights on it. Ignoring the complaints from his arms, Kirk climbed the ladder, and his impulse was rewarded. At the tower's top was an open-air platform that offered a view over the east side of the center to the bay, the Golden Gate, and, almost invisible through the growing fog, a few pale lights that marked the old Presidio and the Academy. But Kirk didn't care about that. He stared into the soft-grained nothingness, willing the fog to part just enough for him to see a few of the lights of San Francisco. But the fog did not obey him. Instead, it grew thicker, until even the lights of the bridge that offered a way out of this place and back to his life were swallowed. Now the only lights were those of the center, his life's new boundaries. Shutting out the despair that waited always to claim him, Kirk climbed down the ladder. He reached the Gold Team barracks just before 2400 hours. The door opened quietly, and he had no trouble retracing his silent steps to his bunk. This wasn't where he wanted to be, but at least now he felt he could sleep. He stripped off his clothes and slipped under the covers. The lights blazed on. "Mr. Kirk," Master Chief Gianni shouted. Chapter 35. This time, the punishment wasn't push-ups for Kirk, it was calisthenics. For everyone. Within 5 minutes of Kirk's return to the barracks, all 18 members of Gold Team, groggy and stumbling, were up, changed into exercise gear, and jogging out to the athletics field. Gianni put them through their paces for an hour, lunges, jumping jacks, Klingon squats, and push-ups, and she made certain every member of the team understood why they were out in the cold and the fog in the middle of the night. "Starfleet is a team," she told them as she paced in front of the huffing and puffing teenagers. "You sorry lot are a team. Each one of you is responsible for team success. Do you hear me?" The wheezing, gasping voices answered, "Yes, Master Chief." "When you are in deep space and your ship's in distress, each one of you is responsible for protecting your whole crew from harm. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Master Chief. If a crewmate dies, then it is your fault, and that will be worse than death for you. Do you understand?" "Yes, Master Chief." The exercises were so standard, and Master Chief Gianni's rote exhortations so obvious, that Spock found he could actually meditate during the activity, at the basic level at least. Thus, at the end of an hour, he was the only member of Gold Team not to have faltered, the only member not out of breath, the only member not even sweating. He felt refreshed. The other members, complaining among themselves, red-faced, coughing, and walking slowly back to their barracks, took notice of the fact that what had been punishment for them was not punishment for Spock. And before they were halfway back from the athletics field, Spock found the only other member of his team he could walk with was Jim Kirk, who had been ostracized by the group just as thoroughly. They said nothing as they walked beside each other. Spock couldn't ascertain what it was Kirk was feeling, and he didn't want to know. Back in the barracks, 5 minutes after the second lights out for the evening, Spock heard 17 breathing patterns indicative of sleep. Expecting no other disturbances for the night, he fell asleep at once. This time he dreamed of his Selot and the dry, hot, peaceful deserts of home. Water. For Kirk, his second day in Starfleet began in a blur. Reveille at 0500 hours, then barracks inspection, during which he found everything in his locker had been jumbled about. The same had happened to Spock's. Then breakfast at 0545. The unappetizing extruded protein was delivered in the form of thick white slabs of pseudo-eggs and thin pink sheets of pseudo-ham. Kirk and Spock ended up facing each other over their trays at the end of a table in the canteen. No one else would sit with them. "Just fruit?" Kirk asked. He wasn't really interested, but he wanted to show the other members of his so-called team that he was capable of having a conversation. "I prefer not to eat animal flesh," Spock said, as he ate his apple with a knife and fork. Kirk held up a strip of glistening pseudo-ham with his fingers. "I guarantee this has never been anywhere near a real pig." "Of course not," Spock said. It has been designed to last for years of storage as emergency shuttle rations." Kirk stared at the dangling strip of pink substance. "Shuttle rations?" "That is what recruits eat for the first 2 weeks of basic training. The information was in the documents we signed yesterday. As we gain an expertise and earn our ratings, we will be rewarded with improved rations. Starfleet advancement is based on competition." Kirk dropped the extruded protein back on his tray. "They plan everything. Careful planning is essential to surviving in the unforgiving environment of space." "You're actually enjoying this, aren't you?" Spock couldn't understand how the human could ask him that question. Vulcans were the first alien species to make public contact with humans. They were the alien species humans had known the longest and interacted with the most. But humans still knew shockingly little about them, and Spock wondered if that ignorance arose from a general disinterest or some misguided belief that, in the end, all aliens were just like humans. "I am a Vulcan," Spock said evenly. "Vulcans do not enjoy. That is an emotional response to stimuli." Kirk grinned. "Whatever you say, Stretch. But if that's the case, I'd sure like to know where all the little Vulcans come from." Spock ignored him in his ignorance, and Kirk leaned forward and whispered, "We need to have that talk about what Sam and I were discussing in the cell." Spock turned his attention to his orange. "At 0820 hours, the first instruction period will commence. At that time, you and I are directed to go to the processing building to take our Starfleet vocational aptitude tests." The other members of Gold Team had taken their tests prior to induction, and most were already assigned to their specialty streams. "We will be able to talk then, without risk of being overheard." Kirk nodded, went back to his extruded breakfast. "It's good to know that Vulcans know the importance of keeping a secret." Spock methodically chewed his orange segment with no intention of taking part in a conversation on that particular topic. He had far too many secrets of his own to protect and could not begin to imagine ever sharing them with humans. The SVA tests were scheduled to take place over 3 hours. Spock completed his in 34 minutes, Kirk in 2 hours. The education petty officers skimmed through their test pads to be sure no sections had been missed and seemed disappointed when he had to release the recruits early. "Noon meal is at 1100 hours, Spock informed Kirk as they left the building. "That gives us 30 minutes. "A noon meal at 11 a.m. Kirk shook his head. "What kind of ranking does that give Starfleet on the old logic meter?" Spock didn't know what kind of reply such a confused question warranted, and so disregarded it. He selected a path that would take the two of them approximately 30 minutes to traverse on their way to the canteen. He looked around and saw that no one was within earshot, at least not within human earshot. "If I understand what you and your brother discussed the other day, then it appears you are withholding evidence of a murder. You don't waste time, do you?" Spock took a chance. "I believe that we each have information that might have a bearing on the difficulties each of us face. Therefore, logic suggests we should share what we know. Why would you not report a double murder to the authorities?" Kirk stared at him for a moment, as if uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Because I can't be sure it happened." "Your brother is prone to stating untruths?" Kirk's discomfort seemed to grow greater. Sam gets confused sometimes, anxious, and these people he's dealing with, they know it, and they play games with him to rattle him even more. Spock tried to follow the rambling path of reason, Kirk implied. So, you believe there is a chance the murders did not take place, as your brother claims? Honestly, I don't know. But what gets me worried is that your two agents didn't show up in court. Words came out of Spock so quickly he had no chance to hide his regrettably emotional response of shock. The consular agents? How are they involved with this matter? Kirk stopped walking, looked at Spock. I thought you heard every word Sam and I said. As much as Spock had enjoyed letting this human believe his auditory ability was indeed superhuman, he knew now he had to confess his limits, just as he had to work on not enjoying being better than humans. Based on what I heard you whisper, Spock said, I believe there were some words you did not voice, specifically when it came to identifying the victims. Kirk thought, nodded. You're right. We didn't say Vulcans out loud. Spock's mind raced as he tried to analyze all the permutations. You believe the consular agents were the individuals Sam saw disintegrated? He said 2 Vulcans. The agents were always a pair, and they didn't turn up in court. Spock stood still in thought, finally shaken out of his concentration when Kirk said, Okay, there's obviously more going on here than I know about. We have to talk to someone, tell someone. What about Mallory? Spock shook his head. There were still more possibilities he had to work through. You must answer a question for me first. Your brother mentioned someone's girlfriend. The name he used was Dala. Do you know her? Kirk shook his head, then appeared to see through Spock's attempt at emotional control. Do you? He asked with interest. Spock reluctantly said he did. She is associated with a human called Abel Griffin. Now Spock was startled by the effect the name had on Kirk. I take it you know him. Kirk appeared shaken, almost physically. I never thought... But Matthew, of course. He's still working with Griffin. He looked at Spock as if he'd been slapped. How do you know him? Spock wasn't about to reveal the possibility that criminal activity might be underway at the Vulcan compound. I know of him, he said, seeking and finding the line between lying and not telling the complete truth. His name and Dala's are connected to what might be attempts to penetrate the security of the Vulcan diplomatic compound. Fortunately, Kirk didn't press the matter, as if anything involving the Vulcan compound wasn't worthy of his interest. Instead, he seemed to come to a decision regarding what was of concern to him. I take it back. Mallory isn't the person to tell this to. We can't trust anyone at Starfleet. Now it was Spock's turn to be startled, though this time he did a better job of hiding his reaction. Why? You have to trust me, Stretch, Kirk said. Spock wasn't inclined to do so, but he detected no obvious physiological sign that the human was speaking anything other than what he believed was the truth. I can't tell you how I know, Kirk continued, but Starfleet claims that Griffin is dead, that he died 3 years ago. If it is the same Griffin, then Starfleet has made a mistake. Oh yeah, Kirk said, and Spock could sense the young human's unease transforming into focused anger. It's what they do best. Then before Spock could object, he added, Look, you're right. We have to tell the authorities, except not Starfleet. The thing is, they might be involved. Maybe not all of Starfleet, but some group who should know better. Involved in what way? Spock asked. Kirk gestured helplessly. I don't know. But we're talking about humans, okay? We're weak. We're greedy. We look after ourselves before we look after others. Not in my experience. Kirk frowned. You're really not from around here, are you? In the interest of expediency, Spock conceded the point. Can you get in touch with Vulcan authorities through your embassy? Certainly. Then do that, Kirk said. Call them. Tell them about Griffin and Dala. They're probably operating out of this robotic freighter at the docks. It's called the Pacific Rome. Got it? Spock listened with a practiced expression of bland indifference, struck by how much Kirk knew. "Yes," he said. "Tell them you heard some prisoner talking and holding about seeing 2 Vulcans killed. Do your best to keep my brother's name out of it. I have to make sure he's somewhere safe before anyone can get word to Griffin that the authorities are onto him. Otherwise, he's going to kill Sam." Kirk blew out a tense breath. "He'll probably come after me, too." Spock still needed to know the reason for Kirk's suggested strategy. "Why do you believe it is better for me to tell Vulcan officials than for both of us to tell Starfleet authorities?" "I already told you," Kirk said. "Right now, we don't know who we can trust in Starfleet. But you can trust your people, right?" "Of course," Spock said, believing no such thing. "Then they're the ones to tell. They can go right to the top, leave Starfleet out of it, and bring in Federation security. When can you call them?" "I believe I can receive permission to make a personal call during the noon meal." "Good, do that." Kirk looked off into the distance. "And I know what I have to do." "What?" "I have to get evidence. Physical evidence that I can hold in my hands and show to someone other than Mallory, so none of this can get covered up." "What kind of evidence?" "In the warp lab at the Sloan complex. Someone installed a device there to jam the security system on the dilithium vault. A couple of days ago, I almost got to it, but Mallory stopped me. That's why we can't trust him. He's stopped me from everything I've tried to do to find the real thieves. Griffin and Matthew and Dalla and their whole gang." Kirk paused as if a major realization had just come to him. "Mallory's in on it. That's the only answer. So it's up to you, Stretch. You have to tell your people everything." Spock nodded calmly. At any other time, in any other circumstances, he would have guided Kirk through the strained chain of logic he had forged to reveal the weak links and identify unsupported conclusions in order to arrive at a more robust and realistic approximation of the truth. But in this case, at this moment, Spock didn't dare, because the human's logic so closely mirrored his own. Jim Kirk felt they could not take what they knew to Starfleet because there was no way to know who in that organization was actually involved with the criminals. For the same reason, Spock knew that he could not possibly reveal any of these details to the security office at the Vulcan compound, because to the best of his knowledge, they were already aware and involved. It was most troubling that he and Kirk had each had a different piece of the puzzle that could explain the Vulcan embassy theft ring and Sarek's involvement with it, and how Griffin and Dalla and Kirk's brother were somehow further connected in what could be the same mystery. Fortunately, though, Spock reassured himself. Jim Kirk had told him all that he knew before he had been required to tell Kirk anything. Certainly, then, he could control the situation and handle it himself, though there would definitely be an advantage to having the young human provide help, as long as Kirk didn't know any more details than absolutely necessary. "I'll contact the embassy," Spock agreed. "In the meantime, if you believe there will be evidence available for you to find in the Sloan complex, I can suggest a way for you to find it." Kirk didn't look hopeful. "Is there anything we can do that fits in with the sacred daily routine?" "Yes," Spock said. "There's a simple way for both of us to gain entrance to the lab, with the approval of the STC." Spock knew that was the way to get Kirk's full attention. When it came right down to it, humans were simple people, easily distracted. So Spock told Kirk his plan. Chapter 36. At 1700 hours, Kirk gazed blankly at the supposedly inspirational display screens in the waiting area outside the office of Command Master Chief Alan Fifield, the senior non-com in charge of all STC recruits. Master Chief Gianni had taken pleasure in ordering Kirk to appear here at this time. Then she had taken even more pleasure in wishing him good luck in New Zealand. Spock, however, had briefed Kirk well. For an alien, Kirk had to admit Spock had come up with a good plan, firmly based in the indoctrination papers Kirk had not had time to read. The Vulcan had not only read them, he remembered them, and had discovered loopholes, inconsistencies, and reason for hope. Before the office chronometer had rolled over to 1701, the screen on the desk of the young yeoman serving as Fifield's clerk clicked in. Kirk heard a brusque voice order, "Send him in." Fifield had not bothered to ask if Kirk was present. And Kirk understood what that indicated about the man's character. He was just like Joe Kirk. So Kirk walked into Fifield's office with all the dread of a young boy about to be disciplined by his father. He was 17, but he still hadn't rid himself of that echo of apprehension from childhood. As instructed by Gianni on the first day, when she had described the required procedure for reporting up the chain of command, Kirk snapped to attention before Fifield's desk. The CMC was raw-boned, with leathery skin, and appeared not to have smiled for the past decade. His hair, to no great surprise for Kirk, was trimmed to a crisp crew cut, again like Kirk's father. "Recruit Kirk, reporting his order to Command Master Chief," Kirk said. He kept his eyes locked dead ahead, looking over the CMC's seated form at a large painting on the office wall. It showed 4 figures in old-fashioned bronze-colored environmental suits working inside a section of ripped-open hull plating on a Starfleet vessel. In the background, indistinct Romulan drone ships took on a squadron of Mako fighters, all of space on fire with phase cannon blasts and atomic detonations that dramatically lit the suited figures in the foreground. Kirk recognized the event, the Battle of Upsilon Andromedae, one of the costliest of the Romulan War. The coalition of planets, precursor to the Federation, won that battle only because of the sacrifice of 4 engineers who reconnected a damaged power conduit on the USS Columbia by hand, all 4 then instantly perishing when the power surge brought their ship back to life to turn the tide of battle. Kirk even knew the names of the engineers. He'd had their pictures on his bedroom wall when he was a child. They'd been his heroes then, not now. "You like that painting, recruit?" Fifield barked. "Yes, Commander, Master Chief." "You know the story?" Kirk wanted to get this over with. "No, Command Master Chief." Fifield gave a snort of disgust. "At ease, recruit." Kirk stood at parade rest, hands behind his back. "Do you know how many young men and women apply for Starfleet service each year?" Kirk felt another lecture coming on. What was it about Starfleet personnel that made them want to turn everything into a lesson? Why couldn't they just get on with things? "No, Command Master Chief." "In this system alone, 40,000, including the colonies, close to 100,000. Kirk had not been asked a question, and so he did not respond. Another Master Chief Gianni's first day instructions. "At the STC, we can take in 1,000 a month. At the STC on New Montana, we can take 700 a month. Do the math, recruit. That means Starfleet can accept fewer than 20% of the people who want to serve. But for reasons that are still not clear to me, I ended up with you." Kirk remained silent. He would not give this typically overbearing Starfleet puppet an excuse to chew him out. Fifield dropped a black, wedge-shaped pad on his desk. "I have a report from your team leader. Less than 24 hours at this center, and you broke procedure. An unexplained absence. Do you know the punishment for that, recruit?" Spock had told him. The recruit found to have left his barracks without permission and with no acceptable reason after lights out is subject to 5 demerits and loss of liberty, Command Master Chief. "Oh, sorry," Kirk said that. For a moment, Fifield paused as if trying to reconcile the defiant recruit described in the report with the perfectly behaved recruit standing before him. "Not quite," Fifield said. "For any other recruit, you'd be right, but you aren't any recruit." He held up a smaller, sleeker pad. "This order transferring you from the custody of Starfleet security to this center has an interesting condition. Any breach of the rules of the STC that would normally result in demerits automatically transfers you to the custody of Starfleet Justice for immediate transport to the New Zealand penal colony. Kirk said nothing. That was exactly what he had been prepared for the CMC to say. Is there any reason why I should not inform Starfleet Justice that you are now ready for transport? Kirk prepared to deliver his lines. I have an acceptable reason for being out of my barracks, Command Master Chief. Therefore, I am not subject to demerits, and therefore I am not subject to being transferred to the custody of Starfleet Justice. Stuff that up your impulse port, Kirk thought. Fifield took on an icy edge in his reply. There is no mention of an acceptable reason in Master Chief Gianni's report. Master Chief Gianni did not ask me if I had a reason, Command Master Chief. Just as Spock had predicted, Fifield had been backed into a corner. Gianni had erred in not asking Kirk to explain his actions. Now, Fifield had to, and he did. Kirk poured it on just as Spock had instructed. Because of the unusual nature of his enlistment in Starfleet, he had been denied the opportunity to fully read the documents presented to him when he arrived at the STC. Thus, he had not been made aware of information necessary for him to make informed decisions about his service. In order not to interfere with the smooth operation of the Gold Team barracks, Kirk had waited until all activities for the day had been concluded. Then he had left the barracks and gone to the Aldrin Engineering Hall to read the newest course postings that, regrettably, were not included in the version of the Starfleet Recruits Manual downloaded in his personal reading pad. Upon reading the course postings, he had immediately returned to his barracks. I think that was all in one breath. Command Master Chief, Kirk concluded crisply. Fifield tapped a skeptical finger against his desk. Aldrin Hall closes at 2200. How could you read any course postings? They're listed on a display screen visible from the main doors, Command Master Chief. Kirk was sure of his answer. He and Spock had checked. The finger tapped faster, as if the CMC knew he was being played but couldn't find any evidence. What courses did you see listed that were of interest? Kirk named six courses, all connected to warp engineering, only 2 of which were included in the latest manual. Your school records don't show any advanced courses in multiphysics, recruit. It's a personal interest, Command Master Chief. Personal. It was obvious Fifield didn't believe a word Kirk had said and was ready to pounce. What's the difference between a power transfer conduit and a power transfer grid? Kirk cleared his throat, buying a few seconds' time. Spock hadn't said the interview would get into details. Then again, Starship technology had been a personal interest for Kirk a long time ago, and he dredged his memory. Recruit? Fifield asked with the pleasant tone of someone who had just won a large pot in a hand of poker. In a warp-capable vehicle, the power transfer conduit channels warp plasma from the warp core to the drive nacelles. In a typical dual-bubble Cochrane configuration, a single conduit runs from the core to an arbitrary division point, where it undergoes a magnetically modulated bifurcation before the plasma stream is then physically split to follow 2 separate conduits to the appropriate nacelles. Kirk took a breath, as amazed at what had come out of him as apparently Fifield was. To the best of my knowledge, a power transfer grid is not unique to warp technology, but describes a generalized power distribution system that is used to direct power to various systems on demand in a vehicle, building, or even a city as needed. Command Master Chief. Fifield stopped tapping. Have you always been such a smart-ass, recruit? Spock hadn't coached Kirk on that particular question either. I don't understand the question, Command Master Chief. The hell you don't, Fifield muttered. He jabbed a finger against the control on the wedge-shaped pad, and Kirk saw the screen wink out, as if Gianni's report had been erased. Tomorrow morning, I will have the results of your vocational tests. If they bear out this personal interest you have in warp engineering, I'll recommend you for the warp field qualifications test. And if those results show merit, then you'll be eligible for advanced specialist training. But all of that is contingent on your not giving Master Chief Gianni a single excuse to write you up over the next 4 weeks of basic. Is that understood, recruit? Kirk blanched at the idea of spending 4 more weeks in this hellhole, but kept that reaction to himself. Understood, Command Master Chief. Dismissed. Kirk stepped back once to show a respect he neither felt nor believed the CMC deserved, then spun around and left the office, not certain that he had exactly won in this encounter, but pleased that Starfleet, by being unable to ship him to New Zealand, had definitely lost. And any day that Starfleet lost was a good day in his books. In the CMC's adjacent study, Mallory heard Fifield call out, "Are you happy?" Mallory switched off the screen he'd been using to watch Kirk's interview with the CMC and joined Fifield in his office. "You didn't need me to bend the rules after all," Fifield said. Mallory stared at the closed door through which Kirk had just left. "I didn't expect that." He guessed Fifield's unspoken question. "They'd pick up on Starfleet procedures so quickly." "All I can say is that I'm glad I didn't have to give in the way you wanted." Mallory had instructed Fifield to berate Kirk as much as he wanted, but in the end the recruit was to remain at the SDC and not to be transferred to New Zealand. Fifield rearranged the pads on his desk. "Why is Command so interested in James Kirk anyway? He doesn't belong here. He doesn't want to be here. Forget about this New Zealand threat. Just cut him loose. Everyone wins." Mallory had no intention of getting drawn into a debate with the CMC, just as he had no attempt to explain his decisions to Judge Otago. When he had seen Gianni's report on Kirk's offense, he had immediately contacted Fifield, and with the full weight of Starfleet Command, had formally requested that the CMC not turn Kirk over to Starfleet Justice. As it turned out, though, the request had not been necessary. Mallory hadn't had the slightest indication that Kirk would be able to work within the system to ensure that result for himself. Now, having seen Kirk in action, Mallory realized it was time to move up his plans. "We still need him," Mallory said. "Mr. Mallory, if you want to do that kid some good by exposing him to discipline and an ordered way of life, then get him into UESPA or one of the military commands. Starfleet's not for him." Mallory glanced past Fifield to the painting behind him, commemorating the last time Starfleet's primary mission of exploration had been set aside for an overtly military role. There was only one way to be certain that change in fundamental policy would never again be forced on Starfleet: constant vigilance against threats arising from entities that did not share the Federation's peaceful goals. With that in mind, Mallory graciously thanked the CMC for his input. It was an easier way to end this discussion than by telling him how wrong he was. Then he began to dictate the new orders Fifield was to prepare for recruit Kirk. If the tragic events in that painting were truly to remain in the past, never to be repeated, Starfleet needed people like James Kirk, as much as James Kirk needed Starfleet.